Here's Dennis Prager to tell you what he thinks is making millennials so sad.
Why are so many young people unhappy? To cite just one example, Reuters reported in 2019 that suicidal thinking, severe depression, and rates of self-injury among U.S. college students more than doubled over less than a decade. And unhappiness is hardly confined to Americans. As the social commentator Kay Heimowitz recently wrote, Germans are lonely, the bon vivant French are lonely, and even the Scandinavians are lonely. The British Prime Minister recently appointed a Minister of Loneliness. People have more money, better health, better housing, more education, and live longer than at any time in history.
If you're making minimum wage, which is disproportionately true of young people, then you're making far less money, adjusted for inflation, than people on minimum wage were making 50 years ago. And average lifespans in the US have actually started to dip. The average American lived longer just 5 years ago than they do now.
But people, especially the young, are unhappier than at any time since data began to be collected. Why?
Well, at least part of the explanation could be the generational wealth gap. Generation X made a slightly higher percentage of the money in the economy than we do when they were our age. And the boomers, like Dennis, made a much higher percentage of the money in the economy when they were our age. Boomers have always been getting a bigger slice of the pie than millennials are getting. So when Dennis says that people are making more money now, he's probably talking about the total amount of money being made, rather than the amount of money being made by young people, the people his video specifically addresses.
There are any number of reasons: increased drug and opioid addiction, less human interaction because of constant cell phone use, and young people's fears for their future are the most widely offered explanations. But the biggest reason is the loss of values and meaning.
Citation needed. I doubt Dennis has any citation to back this assertion up, because he already admitted that the most widely offered explanations of unhappiness among the young are cell phone use and fear for the future. Also, Dennis doesn't much care for any evidence that doesn't reaffirm his prejudices. As he once said, ever since I attended college, I have been convinced that either studies confirm what common sense suggests, or that they are mistaken. So if it seems to him to be common sense that the biggest reason why young people are unhappy is the loss of values, then he will reject any evidence you show him to the contrary.
Let's begin with values, and I'll focus on America. The United States was founded on two sets of values, Judeo-Christian and American.
Well, some of those American values are contrary to the Judeo-Christian ones. For example, the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, which tells you that you can worship any god you like, contradicts the First Commandment, which tells you that you must only worship the God of the Old Testament.
This combination created the freest, most opportunity-giving, most affluent country in world history. This is not chauvinism, it's fact.
Yes, I'm sure that was due to values, and the immense theft of resources, the exploitation of slavery, and the enormous population size had nothing to do with anything.
That's why people from every country on earth have wanted to emigrate to America, and still do.
Except during your ill-fated scuffle with Vietnam, when droves of Americans who didn't want to be forced to die for imperialism fled to my country.
Chief among the American values was keeping government as small as possible. This enabled non-governmental institutions, Kiwanis, Rotary and Lions clubs, book clubs, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, bowling leagues, music societies, and of course churches, to provide Americans with friends and to provide the neediest Americans with help.
Well, that's a double-edged sword. It is, of course, great to be able to get help from one's immediate community if you get along with that community, but the downside is that you have to actually fit in and get along with that community. If you don't fit in, they're less likely to help you. If you are a transgender person, for example, it might be hard to find a church group that will help you pay for your HRT. This is just my suspicion, but sometimes it seems an awful lot like one of the reasons why conservatives don't want the government to help people. people is so parochial communities, especially religious ones, can more effectively demand conformity in exchange for charity. But the phenomenon of people being less engaged with their communities over the last several decades has been pretty thoroughly studied, most prominently by the political scientist Robert Putnam. When I was in college, I took a whole class just on Putnam's work. One thing he points out is that the prevalence of technology correlates pretty closely to the drop in membership in organizations like Lions clubs and bowling leagues. This is especially true of television. That Dennis mentions bowling leagues makes me think he may even have skimmed Putnam's work, given that his most famous book is called Bowling Alone, because it uses the decline of bowling leagues as a prime example of the phenomenon. Putnam doesn't attribute the decline in community interaction to a loss of values or the size of government so much as to the rise of so many other things people can now do to occupy their time. People are less inclined to go to a sporting event with a group of friends when each of those friends can watch that game in the comfort of their own home. But that's a conclusion that's inferred from the evidence, and we know Dennis doesn't trust conclusions that are evidence-based.
But as government has gotten ever larger, many of these non-governmental groups have dwindled in number or simply disappeared. Another set of values is referred to as middle class or bourgeois values. These include getting married before having a child, making a family, getting a job, self-discipline, delayed gratification, and patriotism. All of these have been under attack by America's elites with the following results. The majority of births to millennials are to unmarried women. Yet according to a 2018 Cigna study, single parents are generally the loneliest of Americans. The percentage of American adults who have never been married and who have no children is at an historic high.
This is true, but there's another side to this. Divorce rates are down, and I don't just mean that divorces in total have declined, which would be expected if the frequency at which people get married has declined. I mean that the percentage of marriages that end in divorce is down. Divorce rates peaked in the early 80s. That's the origin of the oft-cited claim that half of all marriages end in divorce. Nowadays, however, only about 39% of all marriages end in divorce in the US. There has been a decrease in quantity, but seemingly an increase in the quality of marriages. An increase in the total number of marriages could therefore lead to an increase in the proportion of those marriages which are unhealthy and unhappy.
Then there's patriotism. Until the 1960s, Americans grew up loving their country, admiring the founders, and believing in America's values, most especially liberty. Americans did not ignore the bad parts of their history.
Well, to at least some extent they did.
But they were wise enough to recognize that what made America exceptional was not its flaws, which were all universal.
To say that America's flaws are universal and were not the basis of its exceptionality implies that every country on the planet conquered as much territory and took as many resources from as many people as the United States did. This is obviously not the case.
But its virtues, which were not. This strong American identity provided generations of Americans with roots, community, optimism, and meaning. Which brings me to the most important reason for all this unhappiness, a lack of meaning. As Viktor Frankl, the renowned Austrian-American psychoanalyst, wrote in his masterpiece, Man's Search for Meaning, aside from food, the greatest human need is meaning. And nothing has given Americans, or any other people for that matter, as much meaning as religion.
Well, in that book, Frankl outlines a few ways you can find meaning, and not one of them depends on religion.
But in the West, since World War II, God and religion have been relegated to the dustbin of history. The result is that more than a third of Americans born after 1980 affiliate with no religion. This is unprecedented in American history, and it's even worse in Europe. Maybe, just maybe, the decline of Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism, those great providers of meaning, is the single biggest factor in the increasing sadness and loneliness among so many young people in America and around the world.
Or maybe, probably significantly more than maybe, the folks who study this phenomenon and base their conclusions on the evidence are correct, and the media, especially social media where people constantly fight with each other, when they're not flexing about how great their lives are to make other people jealous, and which is responsible for people being disconnected from one another, is largely to blame for the unhappiness of millennials, in addition to the fact that they are significantly poorer than boomers like Dennis were when they were our age.
Young people have been told God is nonsense, their country is essentially evil, their past is deplorable, their future is bleak, and marriage and children are not important. Why are so many young people depressed, unhappy, and angry? It's not capitalism or income inequality or patriarchy or even global warming. It's having no religion, no God, and no country to believe in.
Even if that were true, and the evidence fails to suggest that it is, if you want to solve that problem, the onus is on you to make the case that there is a religion, a God, and a country worth believing in. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.